I talk a lot on this channel about bad advice, the crappy societal programming that we have all been fed. And one of the worst pieces of advice for sensitive people is you can't live in fear. To that I say, I can, I will, and I do. I've lived all of my life in some state of fear. As a sensitive, introverted, empathetic person, I'm scared most of the time, and yet I continue to strive to live a life I love. If you are new to this channel, welcome. I'm Michelle from happyhealthyher.com, and in this compassionate chat, I wanted to share my perspective on fear. There is no stopping fear. It is a normal, healthy, emotional response to a world that is just filled with dumpster fires. For those of us who are sensitive, and quite frankly, even anyone who's just paying attention, life is scary and it is hard. And admitting to that is not weak. It is honest and it is brave. I have this inspirational note on my filing cabinet that says, "Be a warrior, not a worrier." But the truth for me is I am a worrier and a warrior. Those two states can exist together, and they frequently do. Some of the bravest people I've encountered in life were nervous Nellies like me. So for the sake of discussion, I'm going to talk about some of the most terrifying things I have been through in my life that I continue to show up for again and again. The fear never went away. I just learned to surrender to it. So I've mentioned before that I am the INFJ personality type, and I am also deeply sensitive, and I refer to myself as an empath. I have had a lot of shyness in my life. I've been deeply introspective and introverted, but I grew up in a household filled with extroverts. Our house was always a social gathering spot, and there were always parties and lots of people coming and going. And so a lot of times it was very overwhelming for me. The number one thing that my mom used to say to me all the time is that I needed to come out of my shell. And so she would push me, push me, push me. And the funny irony of that to me now is that I have learned through diving into my natal chart that I have 4 very prominent Cancer placements. So coming out of my shell, quite literally, is not possible for a Cancer crab like me. So I've been striving to be and do things that were not necessarily part of my natural makeup. And now I have surrendered to who I am, and I am able to see things a lot more clearly. So as a perspective, when I was 5, shout out to all my other Gen Xers who grew up in the 70s, 80s. I learned to ride a bike. And this is a big rite of passage for a lot of us. But what I then proceeded to do is jump on that big old banana seat with my bell and my basket and ride a mile to one of my friends' houses. I used to do it all the time. And I was terrified of the big kids. I was terrified of the bullies. I was terrified of the neighborhood dogs when we didn't have leashing laws. And of course, I was terrified of flying over the handlebars, which is what like every kid does when they first start to learn a bike back in the days before we had helmets. So I got the chin scar to prove it, like many do. But my point of this is I was scared every time I got on that bike, but I also loved riding that bike, and I rode like far and all day long, and it was like a source of joy, even though it was also a little bit of terror. So add to that, when I was around 6 or 7, I learned how to water ski. So I was lucky enough to grow up on a really large freshwater lake. And so another rite of passage on the lake was to learn to water ski. If you are not familiar with this wild sport, you are quite literally, you have 2 slabs of wood slapped to your feet, and then you're holding onto a handle that is tied by a rope to the edge of the boat. And then the boat lurches forward, and you're dragged through the water, the pond water, coming up your nose into your mouth in a sheer state of drowning until, by the grace of God, you suddenly are up on those two slabs of wood and balancing on the water, careening through over the waves. It's like the craziest thing. And it usually takes like 20 tries, probably even more, of being dragged through the water until you do get up. And so, I mean, kind of stressful, kind of terrifying. And then to add to that, there were huge, and I do mean huge, like this size snapping turtles in the lake. So there were certain areas of the lake where you would see them when we would go out in the boat, you would see them come up. And so when I tell you I was holding on to that line for dear life when I was skiing, I'm not exaggerating. I was so afraid to fall, thinking I was going to get eaten by snapping turtles. I still would ask my dad to take me skiing. I still did it all the time. I did it scared. So on that same note, right around the same time, when I was 7, I started to play sports. I started out like most kids in t-ball, and then started playing regular girl softball, and then basketball in junior high, and then finally tennis and volleyball in college. I was lucky enough to be a natural athlete, but I got to tell you, I was nervous every single game. Like sick to my stomach, nausea, knees shaking, nervous every time. And it was funny because my mom created a little routine for me to calm down. I would have bubble baths before softball games when I was 7 or 8. And that seemed to help me. But I never got over that fear. And I used to look around at my teammates, and they always seemed to be having so much fun and not really caring that much about the outcome. But I not me. I was so afraid of messing up. I was so afraid of disappointing my teammates or not winning. And then I was even afraid of disappointing the other team because somebody has to lose. So I would feel bad for the people who lost. It was like a crazy, crazy emotional ride for someone who is empathetic. Again, though, I did enjoy sports, and so I kept doing it. But it was never easy. So INFJs are known to be paradoxes. And one of the greatest paradoxes for me is that despite my nonstop fears, I am also a bit of a thrill seeker. In fact, I love roller coasters. They scare me, but I still get on them. And I had been frequenting amusement parks right up until my 30s. And I would still go to this day if it fit into my schedule and I had anyone to go with. But since I don't do that anymore, in 2019, after meeting my partner, I started riding on the back of his motorcycle, which is just as good for a little bit of a thrill. But as I shared in a previous blog, I will link to that below. Every single time we pull out of my driveway on his bike, I have this sensation that I am going to go careening off and to my death. It's like the weirdest thing. You feel like your body, your soul drops out of your body. It's scary. And I asked other people who are my partner's friends who ride if they related, and they do. Most of them do. It's sort of part of the package is that you just sort of surrender into that fear. The fear doesn't go away though. You're scared every single time, and that's healthy and normal and human. So to keep this from getting too long, I won't even go into my other experiences in terms of moving away for college and then living outside of Chicago for an internship, or then moving to an entirely new state where I didn't know anyone, or even getting trapped in a narcissistic marriage, which you may have heard me talk about before. But the culmination of all this buildup of fear and trying to suppress it was that in 2008, I started having severe panic attacks, and I had what I now understand was probably anxiety disorder. And it took me around 4 more years of real patient work and effort and learning. I've mentioned before, I got a master's degree in integrative health and healing, and I learned natural ways to relieve the anxiety. And so then I got on top of it and I was able to feel better and be more empowered. But why am I telling you all of this? I'm sharing this because I really wanted to hammer home the point that I have lived in a fear spiral my entire life, yet I have been able to rebuild my life and constantly put myself out there over and over again. I've had lots of successes and even had fulfilled a lot of my dreams, but it has never been easy. And I have never not had fear. I just kept moving forward, and that is the key there. We can't fight or eliminate fear. The best we can do is surrender to it. And in fact, the practice that I found most healing in getting over my anxiety disorder was telling people that I had anxiety, because my anxiety had grown to feel like an elephant in the room. And I was expending so much energy just trying to hide it, just trying to stay normal, just trying to stay functional when this raging fear was brewing inside of me. So two things happened when I started to show up vulnerably and tell people that I was feeling anxious. One, people would look at me like I was crazy and they couldn't even believe I would be sharing something so personal or that honest. And that actually showed me who my safe people were. It showed me who had empathy and who didn't, and who was going to be most comfortable for me and who wouldn't. And number two, which was actually far more common, the people I would be in presence with, who I would share that with, would suddenly relax their entire bodies, and they would look at me with this knowing and this compassion and even just like this camaraderie, and they would often share that they too had anxiety. And guess what? Most people do. Anxiety has become so common in the stressful world we live in that it's actually rare to meet someone who doesn't understand how it feels. It's just a common thread of being human to feel fear and sometimes be overcome by it. So my ability to embrace and honor my fears and anxieties has me now feeling healthier and stronger and more empowered than I've ever been. And now I give myself the space and the time to process and heal when I have fears arise. But I would never have gotten to that place if I embraced the advice that you can't live in fear. I know for a fact that the more I was trying to suppress my fear, the more the anxiety was flaring. That's how that works. So I was telling my partner that I was planning on doing this video, and he is an Aries rising, and he is one of the most naturally confident, assertive, and outgoing, brave people I know. So he was trying to convince me that people mean well when they tell us not to live in fear. And I truly do understand that. I do. But what I also know is that he and many of the other people who offer advice from that place of you can't do this don't realize what it's really like to live in a sensitive, nervous body. My reaction to fear is like a raging fire, whereas his reaction is like a candle burning. There's barely a comparison. And so while someone might mean well when they make a statement like that, many times they're not actually coming from a true place of knowing and experiencing what that feels like. So the bottom line is I don't want anyone to feel ashamed when fear naturally arises, as it will. I've talked about this before in terms of anger, but when we try to fight any one of our natural emotions, anything from fear, grief, sadness, or disappointment, what we ultimately do is then layer on shame, self-loathing, and embarrassment, on top of all the other painful feelings, which just get heavier and heavier and heavier for us. It doesn't help. And in fact, it actually makes us sick. So if you're feeling afraid right now, trust me, you are not alone. We will get through this. Give yourself a break. And when you are ready, the better piece of advice is to feel the fear and do it afraid. I love you, and I hope this helped. I wish you happiness and good health always, and thanks for being with me.